Hey guys, today we begin with true stories of people who met sharks and never came home. From crowded war shipwrecks to sunny holiday beaches, you'll hear how calm water can turn deadly in a heartbeat. Settle in as we gently explore the deadliest shark attacks ever recorded, letting the rhythm of the waves guide you towards sleep. But before you get comfortable, please make sure to like the video and subscribe if you appreciate the work I do here. And please let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, put your phone or television remote out of reach, and let's move into tonight's journey together. The waters of the Mozambique Channel hold many secrets beneath their deceptively gentle swells. In late 1942, as war raged across continents, these waters became the silent witness to one of history's deadliest encounters between humans and sharks, a tragedy born from the collision of human conflict and nature's most efficient predators. The RMS Nova Scotia was never meant for war. Built in 1926 for the passenger trade, she was a modest vessel of just over 12.0 tons, designed to carry travelers and mail along the African coastal routes. But war changes everything it touches. By 1942, the elegant liner had been repurposed as a troop transport, her comfortable cabins now crowded dormitories for prisoners of war and military personnel. On November 28, 1942, the Nova Scotia sailed alone through the Mozambique Channel. Wartime convoys were the standard protection against German U-boats that prowled these waters. But military necessity had sent her southward without escort, carrying 765 Italian prisoners of war, 134 South African guards, and 118 crew members. The clear southern sky gave no warning of the danger lurking beneath the surface. U-177, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Robert Gissé, had been hunting in these waters for weeks. Through his periscope, the Nova Scotia presented an irresistible target, isolated, vulnerable, and valuable to the Allied war effort. At precisely 7 that morning, Gissé gave the order that would seal the fate of over 1,000 souls. 3 torpedoes cut through the water, leaving faint bubble trails as they raced toward the unsuspecting vessel. 2 torpedoes struck the Nova Scotia's port side, tearing massive holes below the waterline. The third hit near the engine room, delivering the fatal blow. The effect was catastrophic. Boilers exploded, sending scalding steam through passageways. The ship listed immediately, power failed, and many below decks never had a chance to reach the open air. Those who survived the initial explosions emerged onto a tilting deck, watching in horror as the bow rose skyward. No distress call had been sent, the radio room had been destroyed in the first moments. Many of the Italian prisoners, unfamiliar with the ship's layout and locked in their quarters, had no chance at all. Within 5 minutes, just enough time for a man to comprehend his fate, but too little time to accept it, the Nova Scotia slipped beneath the waves, dragging hundreds down with her. But for those who made it into the water, a more primal horror awaited. The Mozambique Channel is known among mariners for its shark population. The region where the Nova Scotia went down sits at the convergence of ocean currents that create a perfect hunting ground for several species of sharks, most notably the oceanic white-typer species that oceanographer Jacques Cousteau would later describe as the most dangerous of all sharks. As survivors clung to debris, the first dorsal fins appeared in the late morning light. The initial attacks likely came from a small number of sharks, drawn by the disturbance and struggling swimmers. But sharks have remarkable sensory capabilities. The vibrations of thrashing survivors, the cloud of human scent dispersing through the water, and most significantly, the blood from those injured in the sinking created an irresistible lure. By afternoon, witnesses reported dozens of sharks moving through the debris field. The maritime disaster had transformed into a feeding frenzy. Survivors later described the water turning red around screaming men, the sudden violent thrashing as victims were pulled under, and most hauntingly, the periods of silence between attacks when survivors could only watch the fins circling, wondering who would be next. The Portuguese fishing vessel Cabora Bassa arrived on the scene approximately 30 hours after the sinking, having intercepted distress signals from the handful of lifeboats that had been successfully launched. By then, only 192 survivors remained from the original one, 17 souls aboard. The fishermen reported having to drive away sharks that continued to circle as they conducted rescue operations. The final death toll was 858, with an estimated one-third of those who survived the initial sinking falling victim to sharks. It represents one of the greatest losses of life to shark attacks in recorded history, though the exact numbers will never be known with certainty. Today, memorials along South Africa's Natal coast and an Italian cemetery in Durban stand as quiet reminders of the Nova Scotia tragedy. The incident became a case study in naval safety protocols, influencing both military and civilian maritime operations. Modern vessels now carry improved life rafts, specifically designed to protect survivors from marine predators, and rescue protocols prioritize swift recovery in waters known for shark activity. As morning light spills across the Indian Ocean, touching the same waters where the Nova Scotia met her fate, there is a particular quality to the silent sea hush that seems to acknowledge the souls lost beneath these gentle swells. The Mozambique Channel continues its timeless rhythm, its depths holding memories of a moment when war and nature's most efficient predators converged in perfect, terrible harmony. The midnight sea was glass. That's how the survivors described it. A perfect mirror reflecting stars that seemed close enough to touch. The USS Indianapolis had completed her secret mission, delivering components of the atomic bomb that would soon end the war. But on the 30th of July, 1945, shortly after midnight, Japanese submarine 158 found her silhouette against that starlit water. 2 torpedoes. That's all it took. 12 minutes from impact to the ocean, swallowing a ship nearly 600 feet long. No distress signal escaped. No nearby vessels witnessed her vanishing. Just 890 men suddenly adrift in the warm Philippine Sea, scattered across miles of gentle swells that belied what waited beneath. The first day, they tried to stay together. Life rafts were scarce, only a few dozen among hundreds. Most men wore kapok life vests that would eventually waterlog and drag them under. They formed groups, linking arms through the night, whispering encouragements, prayers, sea shanties, anything to keep madness at bay. The sharks came with dusk. Not the great whites of popular imagination. These were oceanic white-tips nomads of the open sea with distinctive white-tipped fins. Scientists later called them perhaps the most dangerous shark species of all. Perfect hunting machines that had evolved to patrol these vast blue deserts, where food appears only by rare chance. And so began the rhythm of those 4 nights, a rhythm of voices growing hoarse from thirst, of skin blistering under relentless sun by day, of hallucinations as dehydration tightened its grip, and after each sunset, the shadows that moved beneath. The sharks hunted mostly at night. Survivors would later recall the sudden silence when a man would simply disappear, sometimes a short cry, sometimes nothing at all. Just a ripple where a friend had been moments before. By morning, the groups would count their losses and drift on. The white tips weren't efficient killers of healthy men. They took the weak, the wounded, the disoriented who drifted away from the main groups. But as hours became days, more men fit that description. Oil coating their skin and lungs, salt water consumed in desperate thirst, bringing only greater dehydration. The equatorial sun breaking down reason itself. On the 4th morning, Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn was piloting a routine patrol flight when something unusual caught his iron oil slick, stretching across miles of ocean. Banking lower, he spotted heads bobbing in the water. The rescue began immediately, though it would take hours for ships to arrive. Of the 890 crew members aboard the Indianapolis, only 316 were still alive when rescue came. The rest had succumbed to exposure, dehydration, saltwater poisoning, and yes, the patient-circling predators. It remains the single greatest loss of life from shark attacks in recorded history, though experts still debate how many died directly from shark predation versus the ocean's other merciless aspects. The aftermath brought little justice. The Navy had failed to notice the ship's absence. Captain Charles McVeigh faced court-martial, the only U.S. Navy captain so punished for losing a ship in combat during the war. Remarkably, the Japanese submarine commander who sank the Indianapolis testified at the trial, stating that zigzag maneuvers would not have saved the ship. McVeigh carried that burden for decades, receiving hate mail from families of the dead, before taking his own life in 1968. Only in 2000 did the Navy formally exonerate him, acknowledging the institutional failures that compounded the tragedy. The surviving crew held reunions nearly every year since the war, their numbers dwindling with time, yet the bond unbroken. They spoke often of forgiveness for the Navy, for fate, even for the creatures that had taken their comrades. Many became advocates for shark conservation, understanding better than most the true nature of these ancient creatures, simply following their evolutionary imperative. Perhaps the most profound legacy of those 4 nights was captured by survivor Edgar Harrell, who described looking up at the vast blanket of stars while adrift. "Never had I felt so small," he said, "yet never so certain that something larger than ourselves watches over us all." The Indianapolis survivors floated beneath the same constellations that guided Polynesian navigators, ancient Greeks, and countless sailors before them. The cruel indifference of deep water balanced against the eternal constancy of those distant lights. An arrangement of the universe unchanged since before humans first looked skyward. And so the men of the USS Indianapolis joined that ancient fraternity of sailors who have faced the sea's darkest aspects and found within themselves courage beyond reckoning. Courage to endure one more hour, one more night, to witness one more dawn breaking across an endless horizon. The waters off Danger Point have always been treacherous, their deceptive calm hiding jagged teeth of stone beneath the surface. It was here, on a mild February night in 1852, that the HMS Birkenhead, a magnificent iron troopship bound for the Cape Frontier War, met her fate in the inky darkness. Picture, if you will, the Birkenhead slicing through the night waters, carrying 638 souls. Most were soldiers of the Empire, young men dreaming of glory or merely doing their duty. Among them were also 25 women and children, families following their military breadwinners to distant postings, their possessions packed into trunks and their futures uncertain. At precisely 2 a.m., as most passengers slumbered in their hammocks, a shudder ran through the ship's frame. The Birkenhead had struck an uncharted rock. Water rushed in with terrifying speed, flooding the lower decks where many of the soldiers slept. Those who weren't immediately drowned stumbled up to the main deck in various states of undress, confused and afraid in the darkness. Lieutenant Colonel Seaton of the 74th Regiment of Foot took command of the situation. As the ship began to list dangerously, he made a decision that would echo through maritime history. Rather than allowing panic to reign, he ordered his men to stand fast in formation on the deck. The women and children would take the few available lifeboats. There were only 3, while the soldiers maintained order. "I implore you," he reportedly said, "don't let us add to this terrible disaster by behaving like brutes. Women and children first, then we soldiers will manage as we can." And so they did. The soldiers formed lines on the sloping deck, passing the women and children forward to the boats. Not a single soldier attempted to save himself at the expense of the civilians. They stood at attention, many knowing they were awaiting their deaths, as the ship broke apart beneath their feet. When the lifeboats were away, carrying all the women and children to safety, the remaining men were told they could swim for shore, but they were 3 miles from land in waters known to be home to great white sharks. As the ship split in 2, men clung to pieces of wreckage, to masts and rigging still protruding from the water. As dawn broke, the survivors in the water faced a new horror. In the growing light, they could see the shadows of the reef beneath them and darker shapes moving between. The sharks had come. Captain Wright of the 91st Argyllshire Regiment would later write, "The sharks were all around us. I saw men taken, pulled under right beside me, the water turning red." Of the 638 souls who had been aboard the Birkenhead, only 193 survived that night. The disaster might have been merely another tragic footnote in maritime history were it not for the extraordinary discipline displayed by the troops. Their sacrifice gave birth to what became known as the Birkenhead Drill, the maritime code that women and children should be saved first in any disaster at sea. Queen Victoria, upon hearing of the soldiers' conduct, ordered that the story be read aloud to every regiment in the service. Rudyard Kipling would later immortalize their discipline in verse, To stand and be still to the Birkenhead drill is a damn tough bullet to chew. Today, the wreck of the Birkenhead lies under 60 feet of water off Danger Point, where a lighthouse now warns passing ships of the treacherous rocks below. Sometimes, when the sea is calm and the setting sun casts long shadows across the water, it's not hard to imagine those brave men standing at attention as the decks tilted beneath them, sacrificing themselves so that others might live. In our hurried modern world, there's something both haunting and instructive about such discipline and selflessness. The slow roll of the swells above the Birkenhead's grave seems to whisper a question across time. Would we, in our moment of crisis, stand fast as they did? The summer of 1916 arrived with merciless heat that poured across the eastern seaboard like molten glass. Along the New Jersey shore, thousands sought relief in the cool Atlantic waters, unaware they were swimming toward a nightmare. That July, America was different. No air conditioning, no shark tracking, no understanding that these creatures might pose any real danger to humans. Scientific journals of the day dismissed sharks as timid scavengers, harmless to any living person. Even the Encyclopedia Britannica assured a nervous public that no shark had ever attacked a human in temperate waters. Meanwhile, a polio epidemic ravaged New York City. Desperate families fled toward coastal towns like Spring Lake, Beach Haven, and Matawan, places that promised safety through sea air and salt water. Hotels overflowed, beaches teemed with bathers, the shoreline vibrated with life. On the 1st of July, a young man named Charles Vincent swam just offshore at Beach Haven while his family waited on the sand. What happened next defied all scientific understanding. Witnesses described a large, dark shape approaching. Screams, blood in the water. Vincent died on the manager's desk at the Ingleside Hotel. 5 days later and 40 miles north, Charles Bruder, a hotel bellhop, was swimming beyond the lifeguard line when something pulled him under. The attack severed both his legs. He died before reaching shore. The newspapers, initially skeptical, now erupted with frightening headlines. Yet experts continued insisting no shark could be responsible. Perhaps, they suggested, it was a large sea turtle, or a killer whale, or a submarine-disoriented Spanish mackerel. Then came the 12th of July. Unlike the previous attacks in the open ocean, this horror unfolded in Matawan Creek, a narrow tidal stream flowing inland nearly half a mile from the sea. 3 boys were swimming from a wooden dock when 11-year-old Lester Stilwell disappeared below the surface, yanked under as friends watched helplessly. A local tailor named Stanley Fisher dove in to search for the boy's body. As he swam through the murky water, the shark found him too. Onlookers pulled Fisher ashore with horrific wounds. He died hours later at a nearby hospital. That same day, just a half-mile downstream, young Joseph Dunn was bitten while trying to escape the creek after hearing news of the earlier attacks. Unlike the others, Dunn survived, the only victim to do so. 5 attacks, 12 days, 4 deaths. President Wilson held emergency cabinet meetings where proposals included dynamiting the entire coastline and erecting steel mesh barriers around popular beaches. The U.S. Navy dispatched torpedo boats to hunt the creature. Thousands of amateur shark hunters swarmed coastal waters with rifles and dynamite. 2 days after the creek attacks, a fisherman caught a 7.5-foot great white shark near Raritan Bay. Inside its stomach, human remains. Whether this particular shark was responsible for all attacks remains debated, but the killings abruptly stopped. These events inspired Peter Benchley's novel Jaws 6 decades later, which Steven Spielberg transformed into the summer blockbuster that forever changed how we think about sharks. The fictional Amity Island attacks mirror this real historical sequence with eerie precision. Today, Matawan Creek still winds through coastal New Jersey. As evening settles, cedar-scented air hangs over the marshes. The water darkens to indigo as tide slowly withdraws toward the waiting sea. All appears peaceful, a narrow channel where once, briefly, something ancient and terrible reminded humanity of its vulnerability in the natural world. The summer of 1957 in KwaZulu-Natal should have been like any other along South Africa's eastern coastline, families splashing in the warm Indian Ocean waters. surfers riding gentle swells as they rolled toward the golden shores, fishermen casting lines at dawn, their silhouettes backlit by the rising sun. But nature had other plans. Unseasonal rains swept across the region that year, transforming tranquil rivers into raging torrents. These muddy waters carried more than just silt and debris into the sea. They washed away the delicate balance that had long existed between humans and the ocean's apex predators. At the same time, the whaling industry along the coast was operating at full capacity. Ships returned to port each day, their decks slick with blood and blubber. Processing plants dumped their waste directly into the harbor waters. The scent of death lingered in the air and diffused through the currents, traveling for miles along the shoreline. It was, as marine biologists would later conclude, a perfect storm. The first attack came on the 18th of December, 1957. A young lifeguard named John Cawes was swimming just 100 meters from shore when something seized his leg from below. Witnesses described the water boiling red as they dragged his body to safety. He died before reaching the hospital. 6 days later, on Christmas Eve, it happened again. Vernon Berry, a 23-year-old surfer, was paddling when a dark shape approached from the depths. The shark struck with such force that Berry's board snapped in two. Though rescuers reached him quickly, his injuries were catastrophic. The new year brought no respite. January saw 4 more attacks, 3 of them fatal. February added 3 more to the grim tally. In just 4 months, 9 people had been attacked, and 6 had lost their lives to what locals now called Black December. Theories spread like wildfire. Some blamed the whaling stations. Others pointed to the floodwaters altering shark migration patterns. A few whispered about a single rogue shark, a man-eater that had developed a taste for human flesh. The truth, as is often the case, was more complex than any single explanation. William Anderson, a fisherman who witnessed one of the attacks, later recalled, "The sea had changed. You could feel it. Something ancient and powerful had been disturbed, and now it was reminding us whose world we were really swimming in." The community response was swift and, by modern standards, brutal. The newly formed Natal Anti-Shark Measures Board installed a series of mesh nets along popular beaches. These barriers didn't prevent sharks from approaching the shore. Instead, they entangled and killed them. Between 1952 and 1972, these nets would claim over 4,300 shark lives. For decades, the nets remained unquestioned. They seemed to work. Attacks decreased dramatically. Tourists returned to the beaches. The economic lifeblood of coastal towns continued to flow. But as environmental awareness grew, so did concerns about the ecological impact. Marine conservationists began documenting the unintended victims of these nets: dolphins, turtles, rays, and countless non-threatening shark species. Rachel Navarro, whose grandfather survived one of the Black December attacks, now leads dawn patrols along those same beaches. Every morning we scan the waters with drones and spotters. When we see a shark, we temporarily clear the water. No nets, no killing, just respect for their space and ours. Today, ecotourism companies offer respectful shark encounters in protected areas. Scientists tag and track shark movements to better understand their behaviors. The wounds of Black December have slowly healed, though the scars remain both on the collective memory of KwaZulu-Natal and on our understanding of how humans and sharks might share the vast blue world. The gentle shore break at sunrise now tells a different story, one of caution but also coexistence. November 1943. The vast Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath a copper-tinted sky as the SS Cape San Juan steamed through waters south of Fiji. The converted passenger liner carried over 1,300 souls, American troops bound for the blood-soaked theaters of the Pacific War. As dawn broke across the horizon, the men aboard dreamed of home, of lovers' letters, of lives suspended in wartime amber. What they couldn't see was the silent hunter trailing beneath, not a shark, not yet, but the Japanese submarine 121, its periscope barely breaking the surface as it aligned its fatal shot. At 5:30 a.m., the torpedo struck with apocalyptic force. Steel screamed against steel as the San Juan's hull ruptured, seawater surging through corridors where men had slept moments before. Captain Adrian Nordstrom's voice crackled over the loudspeakers, impossibly calm amid chaos. "Abandoned ship, this is not a drill." The Pacific, once a highway, became a graveyard. Lifeboats descended into waters already slick with bunker oil, black as night in daylight's early hours. Men leapt from tilting decks, their bodies disappearing into foam only to resurface amid bobbing debris. The ship lingered, defiant, refusing to surrender fully to the deep for nearly 12 hours. As dusk approached, a new terror emerged from beneath the surface. Survival now depended on more than mere flotation. The scattered rafts, holding hundreds of survivors, drifted apart under gentle currents, creating islands of humanity in a vastness suddenly charged with dread. "Something brushed against my legs," one survivor later recounted. "At first I thought it was a man swimming beneath us. Then I saw the fin." Tiger sharks, drawn by the commotion and blood in the water, began to gather. These weren't the nervous reef sharks that scatter at human presence. These were apex predators, sometimes reaching 15 feet, with serrated teeth designed to shear through turtle shells and marine mammal bones. They circled the rafts with prehistoric patience. The night that followed was an odyssey of whispered prayers and terrified vigilance. Men took turns hanging over the sides of rafts, splashing to ward off shadows that passed beneath. Those who drifted away from the main flotilla faced the darkness alone. By morning, over 115 souls had vanished, claimed by either the sea's cold embrace or its hunters. Salvation arrived with the submarine USS Dolphin, whose crew spotted the scattered survivors against the dawn horizon. As rescue operations commenced, men who'd survived both torpedo and predator wept openly as they were pulled aboard. Some bore the telltale crescent wounds of shark encounters they'd somehow survived. The Cape San Juan disaster reshaped Pacific convoy protocols. Naval commanders now factored predator behavior into rescue planning, acknowledging the ocean's chain of death that waited beneath any sinking. Escort vessels were newly tasked with not just protection against enemy submarines, but with rapid rescue to minimize exposure to nature's opportunistic hunters. Years later, when Pacific veterans gathered, the Cape San Juan survivors spoke of something strange, how on certain nights, when the moon was right, the waves near Fiji would glow with bioluminescence, tracing patterns that resembled footprints walking across the water's surface. Local fishermen named the phenomenon torpedo dawn, claiming that the souls lost between ship and shark had found a way to walk home across the sea. The ocean remembers what humanity forgets. The Cape San Juan rests in darkness, while above, life continues its endless, precarious journey across the waters that connect us all. As the 20th century faded into the 21st, the once peaceful waters of Recife, Brazil, transformed into something altogether more sinister. The transformation wasn't sudden. Nothing in nature ever truly is, but rather a gradual shift in ecological balance triggered by human intervention. The expansion of the port of Suape in the early 1990s altered coastal currents in ways no environmental impact study had anticipated. The deepening of channels, the redirection of river mouths, the endless parade of massive container ships. Each seemingly minor adjustment to this delicate coastal ecosystem created a perfect corridor for bull and tiger sharks to venture into previously safe swimming waters. These weren't the romantic, misunderstood great whites of conservation posters. Bull sharks, with their broad snouts and capacity to thrive in both salt and freshwater, possess among the highest testosterone levels of any animal on Earth. Alongside them, the tiger sharks, those methodical, curious predators known to consume everything from sea turtles to license plates, found new hunting grounds in the shallow surf zones once dominated by delighted vacationers and local surfers. The numbers accumulated with grim persistence. Between 1,992 and 2021, authorities recorded 64 attacks along Recife's once idyllic beaches. 26 people never returned from those waters. This represents a fatality rate of 37%, staggeringly high compared to the global average of under 10%. For perspective, If you were attacked by a shark in Recife during this period, your odds of survival were worse than a game of Russian roulette with 2 bullets. Behind these statistics were real lives, young athletes with promising careers, tourists on dream vacations, local workers seeking brief respite from tropical heat. Each attack further embedded itself into local consciousness, transforming Recife's relationship with its coastline from one of celebration to one of wary respect. The community refused to surrender its beaches entirely. Local lifeguards pioneered innovative patrol techniques, developing a sixth sense for spotting subtle shifts in fish behavior that might indicate predator presence. Municipal authorities installed a series of nets, though these proved controversial among conservationists concerned about bycatch. More sophisticated measures followed. Electronic deterrent systems emitting pulses meant to overwhelm sharks' electroreceptive organs were deployed at great expense, creating invisible electronic fences in the water. Perhaps most poignantly, annual faith festivals emerged, where local fishermen and religious leaders would gather to bless the sea, spiritual acknowledgement of humanity's complex relationship with natural forces beyond our control. These ceremonies blended Catholic traditions with indigenous beliefs, creating space for communal grief, while affirming the community's determination to coexist with the ocean despite its dangers. Today, if you walk along Boa Viajam's promenade on a quiet evening when the moon hangs low and heavy, you might notice small collections of candles, flowers, and surfboards placed as memorials along the seawall. Some bear names, others simply dates. The night air carries conversations at half volume, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something. Couples still stroll, children still laugh, but eyes drift repeatedly toward the silver-touched waves. The ocean remains beautiful here perhaps, more so because of its acknowledged power. Somewhere beneath those moonlit waters, the ancient predators continue their patrols, neither malevolent nor merciful, simply being what evolution shaped them to be, while humans do what we've always done: adapt, remember, and continue forward into uncertain tides. In the warm waters off Colombo's Gull Face, where the Indian Ocean laps at Ceylon's colonial promenade, a forgotten tragedy unfolded that would reshape how the world responded to marine predator attacks. The Gull Face Hotel and its adjacent bathing club stood as monuments to British colonial leisure, whitewashed buildings where ceiling fans stirred the humid air and cocktails clinked in crystal glasses as the setting sun painted the horizon in shades of amber and gold. On that particular February afternoon in 1955, approximately 37 bathers floated in the placid waters. Among them was Edward Anderson, a British textile merchant, and his wife Helen, who had arrived just 3 weeks prior to establish a trading office. The sea was unusually calm, almost glass-like, reflecting clouds that hung motionless in the tropical sky. Nobody noticed the first ripples. The initial scream came at precisely 4:17 p.m. A dark shadow moved beneath the surface, circling with methodical patience. Witnesses later described seeing what appeared to be a tiger shark, possibly 14 feet in length, though panic likely exaggerated its dimensions. Within 7 minutes, the shark had attacked 4 swimmers. Edward Anderson was taken first, then 2 local club attendants who had rushed to his aid. Helen Anderson survived with catastrophic injuries to her lower extremities. What makes the Gull Face incident particularly notable isn't merely its ferocity but the medical innovations it precipitated. Dr. Lakshman Karyawasam, who had studied transfusion techniques in Edinburgh, implemented the first ever mobile blood bank response to a shark attack. Ambulances were dispatched with refrigerated plasma containers, an unprecedented approach in 1955. Helen Anderson survived solely because of this innovation, though she would never walk unassisted again. The colonial administration's response proved equally significant. Within weeks, the British governor had commissioned a shark barrier system based on South African designs, incorporating electronic pulses that would later become standard in high-risk areas worldwide. More importantly, the incident led to the establishment of the Pan-Asian Marine Predator Response Protocol, which standardized medical approaches to severe marine animal injuries throughout the region. When Ceylon gained independence as Sri Lanka, The protocol remained in place, one of the few colonial systems deliberately preserved by the new government. Today, a small brass plaque near the swimming area commemorates those lost, though few tourists pause to read its weathered inscription. The sea continues its gentle rhythm against the shore, azure and inviting, betraying nothing of what transpired in its depths on that distant afternoon when the waters of Gal Face ran red, and the world learned how quickly paradise could transform into something altogether more primeval. The waters of the Red Sea have long been revered for their crystalline clarity and vibrant coral gardens. Between 2005 and 2025, however, these same waters would become stage to some of history's most puzzling shark encounters. As Egypt's tourism industry boomed in the early 2000s, coastal towns like Hurghada and Sharm el-Sheikh transformed from sleepy fishing villages into international dive destinations. Resorts multiplied along shorelines, their numbers doubling every 5 years. With them came practices that would subtly alter marine ecosystems, underwater restaurants where divers fed fish, increased maritime traffic, and the discharge of food waste from luxury vessels. Marine biologists noted the changes with growing concern. The sharks began associating humans with food, explained Dr. Mahmoud Hanafi in a 2012 report. We were inadvertently training apex predators to approach rather than avoid swimmers. The first cluster emerged in December 2010 in Sharm el-Sheikh. Within 5 days, 5 separate attacks occurred, an unprecedented frequency that baffled experts. A German tourist died while snorkeling just meters from shore. The government responded by closing beaches and dispatching fishing vessels, which quickly caught and killed 2 oceanic whitetips and a mako shark. But the captured sharks didn't match DNA recovered from victims' wounds. The attacks subsided, only to resurface with greater intensity 12 years later. July 2022 brought dual fatalities within hours of each other near Hurghada. The first victim was an Austrian woman who disappeared while swimming. Only her severed arm was recovered. The second, a Romanian tourist, died as horrified beachgoers looked on. The pattern continued into 2023, when a Russian tourist swimming near Hurghada was pulled under by what witnesses described as a shadow that moved like lightning. Beach videos captured his final moments, standing waist-deep, waving to his son on shore, then suddenly dragged beneath the surface in a swirl of red. Each incident triggered the now familiar closure protocols: beaches emptied, fishing boats mobilized, dive operators grounded. Local economies dependent on tourism suffered immensely during these periods, with hotel occupancy dropping to single digits within days of each attack. Among Bedouin communities who had fished these waters for centuries, the attacks reinforced ancient beliefs about the White Death, spirits taking the form of sharks to protect sacred underwater sites from human intrusion. Elders spoke of ancestral agreements with sea guardians, broken by the steady encroachment of concrete and noise. Professional divers developed their own rituals in response. Moments of silent respect upon entering the water, never touching or chasing marine life, and leaving the sea exactly as they found it. These practices weren't mere superstition, but echoed scientific recommendations about minimizing human impact. The sharks aren't malevolent, noted conservationist Ibrahim El-Sher. They're responding to an environment we've altered beyond their evolutionary preparation. What makes these incidents particularly notable isn't merely their frequency, but how they occurred in waters long considered safe. Unlike Australia's remote surf breaks or South Africa's seal colonies, the Red Sea attacks happened in developed tourist areas previously deemed secure for swimming. Yet for all the fear these incidents generated, statistical perspective remains crucial. Even during the peak attack years, a visitor to Egyptian waters faced vastly greater danger from traffic accidents, drowning, or heat exposure than from sharks. Today, as dawn breaks over the Red Sea, the call to morning prayers still echoes across glass-still lagoons. Dive boats venture out carrying visitors eager to explore underwater marvels. In the depths below, oceanic whitetips and other sharks continue their ancient patrol, neither monsters nor pets, but wild creatures deserving of distance and respect in waters that remain fundamentally theirs. Each year, when winter releases its grip on the Cape of Storms, a solemn procession of Italian naval cadets makes its way along the rugged shoreline, their crisp white uniforms stark against the moody backdrop of the African coast. They come bearing wreaths of Mediterranean flowers, roses, lilies, and sprigs of rosemary for remembrance, to honor the 858 souls who perished when the RMS Nova Scotia was torpedoed in these waters in 1942. Many were Italian prisoners of war, their journey home forever interrupted by a German U-boat and what followed in the water. The cadets move slowly, deliberately, their youth a poignant contrast to the lives cut short. Among them walk the descendants of survivors, carrying photographs and small mementos, a pocket watch stopped at the moment of impact, a salt-damaged diary, a wedding ring returned by the sea years after the sinking. "My grandfather spoke of the sharks only once," says Maria Conti, whose grandfather survived 6 hours in the water. "He said they moved like shadows beneath the feet of the drowning. Not hunting, not frenzied as we imagine them, just waiting." She places her hand on the memorial stone, weathered now by decades of salt spray. "He never blamed the sharks. He said they were just being what they were made to be." Beneath the surface, marine archaeologists continue their careful documentation of the wreck. Their work is methodical, respectful. The RMS Nova Scotia is, after all, a war grave. Underwater cameras capture the quiet dignity of the ship's remains. A dinner plate rests in the sand, its blue pattern still visible beneath a fine layer of silt. A shoe, surprisingly well preserved, waits beside a doorway as if its owner might return. The artifacts tell their own story of interrupted lives, of journeys never completed. The divers have an unspoken agreement. They never film the occasional human remains they encounter. "The sea returns things in its own time," explains Dr. Nomsa Mbeki, who leads the archaeological team. "We document, we preserve, but we don't disturb." There's a conversation happening between the ocean and these objects that has been going on for 80 years. We're just privileged observers. What makes this site unique among shark attack memorials is its tone of reconciliation rather than fear. There are no sensationalized images of gaping jaws, no lurid descriptions of the attacks that claimed so many lives after the torpedo struck. Instead, informational panels speak of ecosystem disruption, of sharks responding to an environment suddenly filled with blood and thrashing limbs. "We've learned to remember differently," says local historian Thomas Vilhoen. "Early accounts were all terror and revenge. Now we understand that fear without knowledge is just another kind of darkness. These waters have taught us something about coexistence, about respecting the wild while honoring the human." As twilight approaches, the memorial coast grows quiet. Schools of silver fish dart between the kelp forests that sway in gentle procession, keeping their own vigil for the dead. The narrative of the deadliest shark attack in recorded history continues to evolve, less about monsters now, and more about memory, understanding, and the complex relationship between humans and the living sea that both connects and divides us. The waters surrounding Batavia, what we now call Jakarta, have always been both blessing and curse to the Dutch East India Company. In the spring of 1827, these waters would become the stage for one of history's most horrific maritime disasters, though not from the storm itself, but rather what lurked beneath the churning waves. The Dolwijk was a sturdy packet ship, a workhorse of colonial commerce, neither the largest nor the most elegant vessel in the Dutch fleet, but reliable until it wasn't commoners. Carrying a complement of 73 souls, including crew and passengers, along with a modest cargo of spices, textiles, and official correspondence bound for Amsterdam, the Dolwijk set sail from Batavia harbour on the 19th of March, under fair skies that gave no hint of the darkness to come. 2 days into the journey, the barometer began its ominous descent. Captain Hendrik van Oosten, a veteran of 17 years in these treacherous waters, ordered the sails trimmed as angry clouds gathered on the horizon. By nightfall, the squall had become a tempest of biblical proportions. Waves like moving mountains crashed over the gunwales. The wind shrieked through the rigging like a chorus of the damned. Just past midnight, the inevitable occurred. The Dolwijk struck a reef that tore through her hull like paper. Those who weren't killed in the initial impact soon found themselves adrift in the violent sea. clinging to whatever flotsam they could grasp. What happened next survives only in the fragmentary journal of Second Officer Willem Decker, who was among 3 survivors rescued by a passing Chinese junk 5 days later. His account, preserved in the archives of the Dutch East Indies Colonial Office, is enough to curdle the blood of even the most hardened sailor. "The greybacks came with the dawn," he wrote in shaking script. "First 1, then 3, then dozens. Triangular fins slicing through the waves like scythes. The screams of Bosun Martins still echo in my mind as they took him feet first, the water around him boiling red. The missionary's wife lasted longest, perched atop a floating hatch cover until exhaustion betrayed her. When she slipped into the water, the largest of the beasts, a monster fully twice the length of a man, took her whole in a single bite." Decker's account describes how survivors, spread across perhaps half a mile of churning sea, were systematically hunted throughout that long, terrible day. "They did not feed in frenzy as sharks sometimes do," he observed with the clinical detachment of profound shock, "but rather with terrible patience, circling, selecting, consuming. By sunset the sea had grown quiet, save for my own breathing and that of young cabin boy Peter, who would not survive the night. No trace of the Dolvik was ever found. No bodies were recovered. 69 souls vanished into the depths, consumed by what local fishermen called the grey ministers of death." Subsequent maritime reports from the period noted an unusual concentration of what were likely bull sharks in the waters where the Dolvik went down, possibly drawn by the regular dumping of slaughterhouse waste from Batavia's growing colonial settlements. The disaster prompted the first limited studies of shark behavior in the Dutch East Indies, though these would not lead to any meaningful safety measures for nearly a century. The Dolvik tragedy remains among the deadliest confirmed shark attacks in recorded history, a grim testament to the sea's most efficient predators. Along the eastern coast of South Africa, where the Umzimvubu River meets the Indian Ocean, lies a stretch of shoreline that locals have come to call Hungry Beach. Its proper name is Second Beach, part of the small coastal town of Port St. John's in the Eastern Cape Province. The beach itself appears inviting, golden sands framed by lush rolling hills that tumble down to meet the shore. But beneath its postcard-perfect surface lurks a deadly reputation that has earned it the ominous distinction of being perhaps the most dangerous beach in the world for fatal shark encounters. What makes this particular stretch of coastline so perilous is a unique combination of geographic and oceanic factors. The nearby Umzimvubu River creates a massive estuary system that flows into the ocean precisely where swimmers and surfers gather. During certain tides, especially when heavy rains have swelled the river, powerful rip currents form, invisible highways of fast-moving water that pull straight out to sea. These rips churn up sediment and fish, creating a natural feeding ground that attracts large predators. The murky, churning waters reduce visibility dramatically, meaning that by the time a shark is spotted, it's often already too close for safety. The estuary waters also lower the salinity slightly, creating conditions that seem particularly attractive to one species of shark above all others. Between 2007 and 2013, Second Beach became the site of a shocking sequence of fatal attacks, with 7 surfers losing their lives in an area barely half a kilometre long. The tragedies followed an eerily similar pattern. Avid surfer Lungisani Msungubana was killed in January 2012, his body recovered with massive trauma to his torso and limbs. Michael Zoetler, a German holidaymaker, died the following year when a shark struck while he paddled in shallow water. Before them came Zaman Damaze, Sikanyiso Bangilizwe, Liasandi, Themba Mayiwa, and Gwalani Mayiwa, all strong, experienced ocean-goers who fell victim within this small geographic zone. The frequency of these attacks in such a concentrated area and time frame has few parallels anywhere in recorded maritime history. The primary culprit behind these tragedies isn't the great white shark that often dominates our imagination, but rather the bull shark, known locally as the Zambezi shark. These barrel-shaped predators are uniquely adapted to tolerate both salt and freshwater environments, making estuary systems ideal hunting grounds. They possess among the highest testosterone levels of any animal on Earth, contributing to their notoriously aggressive behavior. Bull sharks hunt using a bump-and-bite technique, often striking with tremendous force in a test bite that, given their powerful jaws and serrated teeth, frequently proves fatal. They're also territorial and can be triggered by the splashing movements of swimmers and surfers, which mimic injured prey. Despite warning flags and increased vigilance, Second Beach remains both beloved by locals and perilous, a stark reminder that in certain unique environments, we enter the ocean entirely at nature's mercy. The silvery light of a full moon cast long shadows across Maroubra Beach on the 12th of February, 1935. The summer air hung heavy with salt and the promise of relief from Sydney's oppressive heat. As darkness fell, the beach became a sanctuary for those seeking respite from their unair-conditioned homes. Among them was Mervyn Gannon, a robust 19-year-old from Maroubra Junction, who ventured into the gently lapping waves shortly after 8:30 in the evening. The moonlight painted the water silver, obscuring what lurked beneath. Gannon swam about 40 yards offshore, enjoying the cool embrace of the ocean, unaware that he was being watched by something ancient and efficient. His peaceful swim ended with a sudden, violent thrashing. Those on shore heard his cries, watching helplessly as he fought against an unseen assailant. By the time fellow swimmers reached him, the damage was catastrophic. Gannon's right leg had been severed at the thigh. Charles Honeysett, a local who would later pioneer the modern rescue board, recalled the night with disturbing clarity. "We carried him from the surf, blood trailing behind us like a macabre pathway across the sand. There was nothing frantic about it. Everyone knew there was no hope. The shark had made its judgment with surgical precision. Gannon died within minutes, his blood soaking into the Maroubra sand. But the night's horror had only begun. Just 30 minutes later and less than half a mile down the beach, William Clark, a 25-year-old father of two, met a similar fate. Swimming in moonlit waters about 50 yards from shore, Clark disappeared beneath the surface with such speed that his wife, watching from the shore, initially thought he was diving. The truth revealed itself moments later when he resurfaced, screaming, his torso ribboned with teeth marks. Despite the valiant efforts of nearby swimmers, Clark bled to death before reaching the shore. The twin attacks sent tremors of fear through Sydney's beach communities. Newspapers called it the Night of 1935, a singular event that changed Australia's relationship with its coastline. Edward "Teddy" Sullivan, who would later serve as Maroubra's chief lifesaver for 3 decades, remembered the aftermath. The beaches emptied. For weeks, the only footprints in the sand belonged to police patrolling for sharks or mourners laying flowers. The ocean became something to fear again. The tragedy catalyzed significant changes. Within 18 months, Maroubra, Bronte and Coogee beaches all featured newly constructed ocean pools, concrete enclosures built into the rocky coastline, offering sanctuary from sharks while still providing the pleasure of saltwater swimming. These pools remain popular features of Sydney's beaches today, living monuments to that moonlit February night. Shark meshing programs were expanded, and the development of rescue equipment accelerated. Charles Honeysett's early designs for the modern rescue board emerged directly from his experience that night, when he realized that quick retrieval of victims might save lives in future attacks. As summer faded into autumn, swimmers gradually returned to Maroubra's waters. But something fundamental had changed. The easy relationship between Sydneysiders and their beloved beaches had been complicated by the moon-silvered memory of a single night in 1935. In the vast blue emptiness of the Pacific Theatre, where the sea itself seemed as much an enemy as the Japanese forces, Australian airmen found themselves in a struggle not against man, but nature's most perfect predator. It was 1943. The war in the Pacific raged with unrelenting fury. A routine patrol near Prince of Wales Island, just a dot on naval charts north of Australia, turned catastrophic when engine failure sent an Australian reconnaissance aircraft plummeting toward the glittering surface below. The impact scattered debris across miles of open ocean, while 9 surviving airmen clung desperately to a single yellow life raft, a tiny island of salvation in an endless sea. The men took inventory of their meager supplies, a few chocolate bars, emergency water rations, and a small canvas shade. Perhaps most concerning was what they didn't have: a radio that had survived the crash. Day 1 passed in a strange, uneasy calm. The sun beat down mercilessly, forcing the men to take turns sheltering beneath the canvas. Some dozed fitfully despite their circumstances. It was near sunset when the first fin appeared, just a momentary slicing of the water's surface before disappearing again. Then another, and another. Oceanic whitetips, the most feared sharks among Pacific veterans. Unlike their coastal cousins, these open ocean hunters evolved to investigate any potential food source with devastating efficiency. The men fell silent, drawing their limbs inward, away from the water's edge. Night brought little relief. Occasional splashes near the raft testified to the sharks' continued presence. Some men swore they could feel the predators bumping against the yellow rubber from below, testing, probing, measuring their prey, perhaps. Sleep came in short, terrified bursts. Dawn of the second day revealed what darkness had mercifully hidden. The raft was now surrounded. The airmen counted at least 7 distinct sharks, each measuring between 8 and 12 feet long. The creatures had adopted a patient circling pattern, sometimes approaching close enough that the men could see their distinctive white-tipped fins and coldly calculating eyes. One shark, larger than the others, repeatedly nudged the raft, causing heart-stopping moments as the fragile craft tilted precariously. Every splash, every movement, invited heightened attention from the circling hunters. The men established a desperate rotation, taking turns watching, rationing water in tiny sips, and occasionally beating the water with shoes when the sharks ventured too close. The sun climbed and descended again, marking 48 hours adrift. The chocolate was gone. Water rations dwindled. Dehydration and exposure took their toll on the men's minds, with some beginning to hallucinate. The sharks, meanwhile, showed no signs of losing interest. It would be another full day before a passing Allied vessel spotted the tiny yellow speck and altered course. Of the 9 men who had entered the water initially, 7 would survive their ordeal, an unusually high survival rate that Pacific veterans would later attribute to pure luck rather than skill. The oceanic whitetips, they knew, rarely left witnesses when encountering humans in their domain. In the clear blue waters surrounding Isla Mujeres Island of Women off Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, renowned Mexican underwater filmmaker Ramon Bravo found himself face to face with what would become one of his most harrowing professional experiences. Bravo wasn't just any documentarian. By 1975, he had established himself as one of the most respected underwater explorers and shark experts in Latin America. His fearlessness when swimming alongside predators had earned him the nickname "the man who talks to sharks." This particular expedition to the waters off Isla Mujeres was meant to capture footage for a documentary about the region's diverse marine ecosystem. The morning began routinely enough: equipment checks, camera tests, the comforting weight of the diving tank. The film crew had spotted several bull sharks the previous day, known locally as tiburones toro, and Bravo was eager to capture them in their natural environment. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Bravo often preferred diving without cage protection, believing it interfered with authentic animal behavior. But on this particular day, something felt different. The water held an unusual stillness. The typical schools of tropical fish seemed scarcer. The crew noticed increased shark activity beyond the reef drop-off more than they'd seen throughout the week prior. Recognizing the potential danger, Bravo made a rare concession to caution. A diving cage was lowered from the research vessel, a simple metal frame that would provide a barrier between himself and the increasingly curious predators. As Bravo descended with his camera equipment, the visibility was exceptional, almost eerily so. At 30 feet below the surface, he could see the sunlight dancing across the sandy bottom, another 60 feet down. It was then that he spotted them, not 1 or 2, but a gathering of at least 6 full-grown bull sharks, each measuring over 9 feet in length. What happened next would later be described by crew members as 3 minutes of absolute terror. As Bravo positioned himself inside the cage, one of the securing cables snagged on the boat's propeller above. The sudden jolt caused the improperly latched door to swing open. The cage, now destabilized, tilted precariously. Bravo found himself half exposed to the circling sharks, with his legs still inside the cage but his torso vulnerable. One particularly large bull shark broke from the group, swimming directly toward the filmmaker with sudden interest. In that moment, Bravo later recounted feeling an overwhelming sense of calm, the paradoxical clarity that sometimes accompanies extreme danger. Drawing on decades of experience, he remained motionless, controlling his breathing, avoiding eye contact with the approaching predator. The shark circled once, twice, coming close enough that Bravo could have reached out and touched its rough skin. Then, mysteriously, it rejoined the others. The boat crew managed to stabilize the cage and slowly bring Bravo back to the surface. Though physically unharmed, the experience profoundly affected him. In later interviews, he would describe it as the closest he had come to becoming part of the food chain. Bravo continued his work documenting marine life until his death in 1998, but he never again dove without properly secured equipment. His encounter at Isla Mujeres stands as a powerful reminder that even for those who dedicate their lives to understanding these magnificent predators, respect for their unpredictable nature must always prevail. The waters of New Uli Bay shimmer like polished obsidian beneath the South Pacific sun. On days when the trade winds ease their constant breath, the surface becomes a perfect mirror, reflecting the volcanic peaks that crown American Samoa. It was on such a day, the 29th of December, 1963, that the village of Nu'uli prepared for its annual fishing festival, unaware that nature had scheduled a tragedy to unfold alongside their celebration. The morning arrived, warm and promising. Children laughed as they helped their elders arrange elaborate displays of woven baskets that would soon cradle the day's catch. The fishing festival was more than mere sustenance. It represented the delicate balance between the Samoan people and the ocean that both sustained and sometimes claimed them. By midday, nearly 200 villagers had gathered along the shoreline. The water was inviting, unnaturally calm. Young swimmers ventured further than usual, their bodies dark silhouettes against the turquoise shallows. No one noticed the large shadow that began to patrol the deeper channel just beyond the reef. The first scream came at approximately 2 in the afternoon. Witnesses would later describe a rolling boil of water, followed by a crimson bloom. A 15-year-old boy was the first victim, pulled beneath the surface so quickly that many onlookers initially thought he had simply dived. Only when he failed to resurface did panic begin to spread. In the confusion that followed, several villagers swam out to search for the missing teen. This selfless act of community would lead to further tragedy. A massive tiger shark, later estimated to be 16 feet in length, appeared in their midst. The shark, likely drawn to the area by the unusual concentration of human activity, displayed none of the exploratory behavior typical of these predators. Instead, it attacked with devastating efficiency. Within 20 minutes, 3 more swimmers had been fatally wounded. The shallow waters of Nu'uli Bay, normally a sanctuary of placid beauty, transformed into a scene of unspeakable horror. Those who made it back to shore spoke of a creature moving with impossible speed, its hide marked with distinctive tiger-like stripes that gave the species its name. Local fishermen mounted a hasty response, taking to their outrigger canoes with harpoons and makeshift weapons. Their bravery was admirable but ultimately futile. The shark evaded capture, disappearing into the deeper waters beyond the bay as mysteriously as it had arrived. When the waters finally calmed and the full accounting was made, 5 people had lost their lives. 3 others would survive with life-altering injuries. The tiger shark responsible was never caught. In the days that followed, the village elders composed a traditional song of remembrance, a haunting oral memorial that recounted not just the tragedy, but the courage displayed by those who risked themselves to save others. This song is still performed during special occasions in American Samoa, a melodic reminder of the unpredictable power of the ocean. The New Uli shark attacks of 1963 remain the worst multiple fatality shark incident in Samoan history. Marine biologists now believe the attack may have been triggered by unusual oceanographic conditions that disrupted normal shark behavior patterns, though this provides little comfort to a community that still bears the emotional scars of that terrible afternoon. So when you find yourself floating in warm tropical waters, remember the lesson of New Uli, that sometimes the most serene moments can hide nature's sharpest teeth. On the northern tip of Andros Island in the Bahamas lies Morgan's Bluff, a craggy limestone promontory that juts into the Caribbean like nature's own watchtower. Named for the infamous pirate Henry Morgan, who allegedly buried treasure in its hollowed caves, the bluff has always been shrouded in mystery. But in the summer of 1980, it became the setting for one of history's most peculiar shark attack cases, if it was a shark attack at all. The story begins with a drug smuggling operation gone terribly wrong. On the 16th of July, 1980, a twin-engine aircraft carrying an estimated $2 million worth of Colombian cocaine crashed into the waters approximately half a mile off Morgan's Bluff. The plane sank quickly, disappearing into the deep blue channel that runs alongside the island. Local fishermen reported seeing the crash but found no survivors when they reached the site. The Bahamian authorities were notified, and a recovery operation was mounted the following morning. By then, the Caribbean currents had scattered much of the debris, but divers eventually located the fuselage in about 70 feet of water. Inside, they found only empty seats and torn safety belts. The two pilots and an unknown number of passengers had vanished. 3 days later, partial human remains washed ashore at Morgan's Bluff. A torso, missing both arms and one leg, was discovered by children playing on the beach. The condition of the remains sparked immediate controversy among investigators. Official reports described the wounds as consistent with shark predation, citing the clean, curved bite marks and significant tissue loss. The local medical examiner, Dr. James Cowley, identified the remains as belonging to a Caucasian male, approximately 30 to 35 years old. No identification was found, and without fingerprints or dental records, the body remained anonymous, a nameless casualty of the illicit drug trade. But the people of Andros Island tell a different tale. According to island folklore, what happened at Morgan's Bluff wasn't simply a matter of sharks scavenging crashed drug smugglers. The older residents speak of the judgment, a phenomenon they claim occurs when the waters themselves pass sentence on those who bring evil to their shores. The sharks are just the executioners, explained one elderly fisherman in a 1982 interview. The sea decides who deserves punishment. Some locals insist they witnessed unusual shark behavior in the days following the crash. Dozens of tiger and bull sharks circling in a tight formation, as if coordinating their movements. Marine biologists dismiss these accounts as superstition amplified by imagination, pointing out that such coordinated predatory behavior has never been documented scientifically. Forensic evidence supports a more prosaic explanation. The pattern of tissue damage suggests the victim was already deceased when the sharks began feeding. Furthermore, trace evidence found in the remaining tissue indicated the presence of gunshot residue, suggesting the smugglers may have turned on each other before or after the crash. The case remains officially classified as death by misadventure with subsequent shark scavenging. Yet, on Andros Island, children are still warned to behave lest they suffer the judgment of Morgan's Bluff, where sharks serve as the Caribbean's grim enforcers of cosmic justice. The plane's cargo was never recovered, and no arrests were ever made in connection with the case. In the summer of 1883, a persistent fog draped itself over Folly Beach like a mourning veil. The locals called it the weeping season, when the Atlantic seemed to breathe its misty exhale onto the shore for days at a time. This wasn't just any coastal development taking shape on the South Carolina coastline, it was the Morris Island Lighthouse, a 161-foot sentinel meant to guide ships safely through Charleston's notoriously treacherous harbor entrance. The lighthouse keeper's diary, discovered decades later in a water-damaged trunk, tells a story the newspapers of the time deliberately obscured. The 16th of July, another worker gone today. That makes 4. The men whisper about demons in the water, but Mr. Tillman says it's just the current. The fog hasn't lifted in 9 days. Construction had begun optimistically enough. The Morris Island project employed nearly 30 men, most locals with generations of seafaring knowledge. They understood the ocean's moods, or thought they did. What they couldn't have anticipated was the peculiar combination of circumstances that summer: unusually warm waters, the dredging operations stirring up the sea floor, and schools of mullet running unusually close to shore. The 23rd of July, Tillman finally admitted something isn't right. They've suspended the underwater foundation work after Jenkins was pulled under. His legs. I can't bring myself to describe what I saw. The company doctor says it was machinery, but we all know better. The pattern was always the same. The attacks came at dawn or dusk, when visibility was at its worst. The men working on the underwater caisson foundation would report a sudden pressure against their legs, then a force so powerful it could snap a diving line. Those who survived the initial bite rarely survived the blood loss. The 2nd of August, the Gullah women from the settlement won't come near the beach anymore. Old Mary says the spirits are hungry because we're building on sacred ground. Mr. Tillman called her superstitious, but I notice he doesn't wade out anymore, not even to his knees. What makes the Folly Beach incidents particularly notable in shark attack history is the systematic nature of the predation. Marine biologists studying the diary entries now believe they weren't facing random attacks, but likely a single shark, possibly a bull shark, that had learned the workers' patterns and deliberately returned to the same hunting ground. The 11th of August, construction halted indefinitely. 7 dead, 3 maimed beyond working capacity. Mr. Tillman received a telegram from Charleston. They'll resume next spring with a new approach. I'm transferring to the Cape Hatteras station. Some nights I dream I'm in the water with them, those dark shapes moving just beyond where the eye can see. The Morris Island Lighthouse was eventually completed in 1885, nearly 2 years behind schedule. Its construction cost more than money, it cost blood. The company records officially attributed the deaths to construction accidents and drowning incidents, but the lighthouse keeper's diary tells the truth. Perhaps most chilling is the final entry from Folly Beach. The 16th of August, fog finally lifted today. As I packed my belongings, I watched the water from the top platform. The tide was going out, and there it was, just waiting. Not moving on with the tide like any normal fish would, just waiting for us to come back. In the warm waters of the eastern Mediterranean, off the coast of what we now call Gaza, a forgotten maritime tragedy unfolded in the summer of 1917. The Great War had been grinding on for 3 years, and the Ottoman Empire, that ancient caliphate stretching across 3 continents, was desperately moving troops and supplies along the coastal waters to reinforce their positions against British advances in Palestine. On a particularly still July morning, when the sea lay flat as hammered silver, an Ottoman military barge crowded with some 200 soldiers departed from a small harbour north of El Arish. These men, mostly Arab conscripts from Syria and Lebanon, had been travelling for days, undernourished and packed tightly on deck like the very sardines that swam beneath their vessel. Their destination was Gaza, where Ottoman forces were preparing for yet another British assault. The barge made slow progress, hugging the coastline as it crept northward. Unknown to the Ottoman captain, Royal Navy destroyers had been patrolling these waters for weeks, seeking to intercept exactly such movements. Around midday, when the heat had become almost unbearable, lookouts on the barge spotted the unmistakable silhouette of a British warship on the horizon. What followed was not so much a naval battle as it was a slaughter. The British destroyer, with its superior range and firepower, opened fire while still beyond the reach of the Ottomans' few deck guns. The first shells struck the barge amidships, splintering wood and metal alike. Within minutes, the vessel began to list heavily, taking on water through multiple breaches in its hull. As the barge sank, those soldiers who had survived the shelling found themselves in the water. Some clung to debris, others began swimming toward the shoreline, visible but tantalizingly distant. What these desperate men didn't know, couldn't have known, was that they had been deposited directly into one of the Mediterranean's most notorious shark channels. For generations, local fishermen had avoided these particular waters during certain seasons. This narrow passage between 2 offshore reefs served as a migration route for several species of sharks, most notably the aggressive oceanic whitetip. These sharks, with their distinctive rounded fins and persistent hunting behavior, had evolved to investigate any disturbance in their domain. The first attacks began within minutes. Witnesses on shore, Bedouin herdsmen, who had watched the naval engagement unfold, reported seeing fins cutting through the water, followed by splashing and screams. The blood from those wounded in the shelling had created a scent corridor, that drew sharks from miles around. As one survivor later recalled, "The sea around us turned from blue to red, and then to a churning pink foam. Of the approximately 200 men aboard the barge, fewer than 40 reached the shore alive. Some died from their wounds or exhaustion, but most fell victim to what would become known locally as the Long Feast." Ottoman military records, later captured by British forces, documented the incident only as transport lost with all hands due to enemy action, making no mention of what had truly happened after the shelling stopped. This incident remains one of history's deadliest recorded shark attacks, not for the number of sharks involved, but for the perfect storm of circumstances that created an inescapable killing zone for men who were already victims of a war that had little meaning for most of them. The waters off Port Lincoln were unusually clear, that December day in 1963, crystal blue, deceptively calm. No one understood this better than 23-year-old Rodney Fox, who slipped beneath those glassy South Australian waters during a spearfishing competition, completely unaware his life was about to change forever. Fox was an accomplished diver, athletic, confident, but confidence means little when you're sharing the water with a great white shark. It happened in seconds. One moment, Fox was scanning the seabed for fish. The next, an immense pressure clamped around his torso. Witnesses would later describe a cloud of red blooming in the water. The great white, likely mistaking Fox for a seal in the poor visibility, had struck with devastating force. The attack was catastrophic. The shark's teeth sliced through Fox's wetsuit, ribs, and lung. His diaphragm was punctured, his spleen exposed, his blood vessels severed. By all medical understanding of the time, Rodney Fox should have died in those waters. But he didn't. Perhaps it was primal instinct, perhaps extraordinary fortune. Either way, Fox somehow managed to pry himself free, the shark's teeth leaving over 462 stitches worth of wounds across his body. The journey to shore was excruciating. Each breath a stabbing reminder of his punctured lung, each heartbeat pushing precious blood through his mangled arteries. Hours later, doctors worked frantically to repair what the ocean predator had torn apart. Most attack survivors would never again enter the water. Most would advocate for shark culls and hunting. Not Fox. Something profound happened during his recovery. Rather than harboring fear or revenge, Fox became consumed with curiosity. Why had the shark attacked? What drew it to him? What was the creature actually like when not viewed through the lens of human terror? This curiosity would transform not just Fox's life, but our understanding of these ancient predators. By 1965, just 2 years after nearly being killed, Fox had designed something revolutionary, the first underwater shark observation cage, a contraption that would allow humans to safely enter the domain of the great white. The very waters that had nearly claimed his life became Fox's laboratory. Port Lincoln transformed from the site of Australia's most famous shark attack into the birthplace of shark cage diving. For the first time, people could observe these creatures not as mindless killers, but as complex apex predators fulfilling their ecological role. Fox's near death became marine conservation's gain. His attack among the most severe ever survived sparked research that revealed these animals weren't the malevolent monsters of nightmares, but essential components of healthy ocean ecosystems. Today, more than 10,000 tourists visit Port Lincoln annually to slip into cages remarkably similar to Fox's original design. They descend into those same cold currents where blood once clouded the water, now coming face to face with great whites, not in terror, but in wonder. Perhaps the true measure of Fox's legacy isn't just that he survived when so many others didn't, but that he transformed personal trauma into universal understanding. From the deadliest depths came our deepest insights into these misunderstood predators that have swum Earth's oceans for over 400 million years. In the pale dawn hours of the 26th of December, 2004, the waters retreated from Sri Lanka's eastern shores with an unnatural haste that puzzled fishermen. The locals call their surrounding waters Pal Samudram, the Sea of Milk, for its usually gentle white-capped waves. But on this morning, the sea was neither gentle nor milky. It was simply absent. When the waters returned, they came as mountains. Walls of ocean up to 30 feet high slammed into coastal communities without mercy. The Indian Ocean tsunami, triggered by the third largest earthquake ever recorded, would claim over 230,000 lives across 14 countries. Sri Lanka absorbed nearly 40,000 of these deaths, the second highest toll after Indonesia. But in the chaotic aftermath of this catastrophe emerged a curious narrative, one that still whispers through coastal villages today. Stories spread of unprecedented shark attacks along Sri Lanka's devastated coastlines. Tales circulated of tiger sharks and bull sharks, drawn by the thousands of decomposing bodies, now hunting survivors who ventured back into the waters. These stories found fertile ground in our primal fear of what lurks beneath the waves. They spread through aid camps, into international news reports, and eventually became accepted as fact in certain circles. The tsunami, it seemed, had unleashed not just its own devastation, but had summoned nature's perfect predators to extend the horror. Except, it wasn't true. Marine biologists who investigated found no credible evidence of increased shark activity in the tsunami's aftermath. The International Shark Attack File recorded 0 confirmed shark attacks in Sri Lanka during 2004 or 2005. Not a single one. What researchers did document, however, were numerous injuries misattributed to sharks. The tsunami had transformed the coastal waters into a hazardous soup of debris: splintered wood, twisted metal, broken glass, and exposed rebar from shattered buildings. Survivors who returned to the waters, often searching for lost loved ones or salvaging possessions, suffered lacerations and puncture wounds that, in the trauma of the moment, were easily blamed on shark attacks. The human mind, seeking patterns in chaos, connected these injuries to shadowy shapes glimpsed beneath turbid waters. Fear did the rest. A shark, after all, makes more sense as an enemy than random debris. It gives form to formless tragedy. This phenomenon isn't unique to Sri Lanka. Similar shark attack myths emerged after the 2011 Japanese tsunami and Hurricane Katrina. In each case, scientific investigation debunked the claims. Sharks typically avoid turbulent, debris-filled waters, moving to deeper, calmer areas during natural disasters. They're seeking safety just as we would. The Sea of Milk eventually returned to its gentle rhythm. The wounds, both physical and psychological, slowly healed. But this chapter reminds us how easily myth can masquerade as fact in the aftermath of trauma, and how our ancient fear of sharks stands ever ready to fill the gaps in our understanding. Sometimes, the deadliest thing in the water isn't what we imagine lurking below, but what we bring with us from above. The coast of Western Australia has always been a place where the line between land and sea blurs into something dangerous. In 1923, near the quiet port of Albany, that line disappeared altogether when the waters earned a new name: Whalers' Graveyard. It was a time when sperm whaling was still a thriving industry in Australia's southwest. The Shanes Beach Whaling Company had established operations along the coast, and each day, tender boats would carry men out to the larger vessels, or to process the remains of the day's catch. Blood, blubber, and offal created a constant slick on the water's surface, extending for miles into the Southern Ocean. What they didn't realize was that they were setting a table for the ocean's most efficient predators. The first attack came on a crisp autumn morning in March. A young tender operator named James McIntosh was transferring supplies between ships when something massive struck his small boat from below. Witnesses on the nearby processing ship described how the water simply erupted around the tender. When the spray settled, McIntosh was gone. Only a widening red circle remained where his boat had been. 3 weeks passed. The company installed wooden gratings beneath the tenders as protection. The men carried harpoons even on the shortest journeys between vessels. But the sharks, likely several large tiger sharks drawn by the whaling waste, had found a reliable food source, and they weren't leaving. The second attack targeted William Harrison, an experienced whaler who had survived 2 shipwrecks in his 20-year career. His tender was moving slowly through early morning fog when the distinctive thump of something solid hitting the hull echoed across the water. Unlike McIntosh, Harrison had time to shout. The nearby processing crew heard his calls transform from alarm to terror to something worse. By the time they reached the tender, they found only Harrison's boot, still laced, floating among the splintered planks. The company considered suspending operations. Money prevailed over safety, the men were offered danger pay, and operations continued under an atmosphere of dread that settled over the fleet like the fog. The third attack, in late May, was witnessed by the entire day crew. Thomas Lynch, transferring whale oil samples to the laboratory ship, was halfway between vessels when his tender simply disappeared in a froth of white water and red mist. Unlike the previous attacks, this one lingered. The shark, described later as longer than 2 men, circled the debris for nearly an hour, preventing recovery efforts. After the third death, the Shanes Beach operation shut down for 6 months. When they returned, they implemented a system of larger, steel-bottomed tenders and established strict protocols about waste disposal further out to sea. But for the families of McIntosh, Harrison, and Lynch, these measures came too late. In a single season, the waters off Albany had claimed 3 lives and earned the name that local fishermen still whisper with unease, Whalers' Graveyard. The sharks eventually moved on when their food source disappeared, but old-timers in Albany will tell you that sometimes, in the early morning fog, you can still hear the sound of splintering wood and cut-short screams drifting across waters that have never forgotten the taste of those who work above them. In the azure waters of Tahiti, where sunlight dances on gentle waves and pearls nestle in the grip of patient oysters, there exists a lagoon with a history as dark as its depths. The year was 1846, when the island still breathed freely, before colonial ambitions had fully tightened their grip on this Polynesian paradise. The French had established their protectorate just 4 years prior, and Christian missionaries floated between islands like driftwood, carrying their gospel in weathered leather-bound books. It was through their letters, penned in candlelight with quills dipped in urgency, that we know of the events at what locals called Fa'ahia Pohopia, the Lagoon of the Last Pearl. Reverend Thomas Pritchard, in correspondence to the London Missionary Society dated September 1846, wrote of how the lagoon had become a site of both sustenance and sorrow. The waters there were unusually fertile with pearl-bearing oysters, drawing canoes filled with eager divers despite the ancient warnings etched into nearby stone. The indigenous Tahitians held complex relationships with the creatures of their waters. To them, sharks were not mere animals but embodiments of ancestral spirits, or makua, sometimes protectors, sometimes punishers. When the first canoe capsized that August morning, the elders nodded knowingly. Someone had broken a tapu, a sacred prohibition. The sharks that gathered in that lagoon were different from others around the island. Smaller than the oceanic predators beyond the reef, these grey reef sharks seldom exceeded 6 feet. But what they lacked in size, they compensated for in territorial aggression, and the lagoon, with its narrow entrance and deep central pool, was their domain. Between August and October of that year, Pritchard documented 7 canoe capsizes, resulting in 11 deaths. Indigenous accounts placed the number higher. What made these incidents unusual was the pattern. The sharks seemed to work in coordinated groups, something rarely observed before European documentation of shark behavior. Chief Teriamarama Ino, whose name translates roughly to the sky of bitter change, had prohibited pearl diving in the lagoon generations before. The prohibition wasn't arbitrary. It coincided with the lunar cycles when sharks gathered to mate in those sheltered waters. But economic pressures from French traders eager for pearls led younger Tahitians to dismiss these ancient warnings as superstition. One survivor, whose account was transcribed by a missionary's wife, described how the sharks would first bump the underside of canoes during certain moon phases. If the occupants persisted, the bumps would become more forceful until eventually the craft would overturn. What followed was described in missionary letters as a frenzy that darkened the waters. After the 11th death, even the French authorities acknowledged the danger. The lagoon was officially declared off-limits, not for respect of indigenous knowledge, but under the rational veneer of public safety. The Tahitians, for their part, performed elaborate ceremonies to appease the offended ancestral spirits. Today, the Lagoon of the Last Pearl remains a place where locals will not fish or swim. Scientists who have studied the site note unusual topographical features that create unique acoustics underwater, perhaps explaining why shark behavior there differs from other locations. But for many Tahitians, the explanation remains simple. Some waters remember what they have tasted, and some hungers never truly fade. In the warm waters off Colombo's Gull Face, where the Indian Ocean laps at Ceylon's colonial promenade, a forgotten tragedy unfolded that would reshape how the world responded to marine predator attacks. The Gull Face Hotel and its adjacent bathing club stood as monuments to British colonial leisure, whitewashed buildings where ceiling fans stirred the humid air and cocktails clinked in crystal glasses as the setting sun painted the horizon in shades of amber and gold. On that particular February afternoon in 1955, approximately 37 bathers floated in the placid waters. Among them was Edward Anderson, a British textile merchant, and his wife Helen, who had arrived just 3 weeks prior to establish a trading office. The sea was unusually calm, almost glass-like, reflecting clouds that hung motionless in the tropical sky. Nobody noticed the first ripples. The initial scream came at precisely 4:17 p.m. A dark shadow moved beneath the surface, circling with methodical patience. Witnesses later described seeing what appeared to be a tiger shark, possibly 14 feet in length, though panic likely exaggerated its dimensions. Within 7 minutes, the shark had attacked 4 swimmers. Edward Anderson was taken first, then 2 local club attendants who had rushed to his aid. Helen Anderson survived with catastrophic injuries to her lower extremities. What makes the Gull Face incident particularly notable isn't merely its ferocity but the medical innovations it precipitated. Dr. Lakshman Karyawasam, who had studied transfusion techniques in Edinburgh, implemented the first ever mobile blood bank response to a shark attack. Ambulances were dispatched with refrigerated plasma containers, an unprecedented approach in 1955. Helen Anderson survived solely because of this innovation, though she would never walk unassisted again. The colonial administration's response proved equally significant. Within weeks, the British governor had commissioned a shark barrier system based on South African designs, incorporating electronic pulses that would later become standard in high-risk areas worldwide. More importantly, the incident led to the establishment of the Pan-Asian Marine Predator Response Protocol, which standardized medical approaches to severe marine animal injuries throughout the region. When Ceylon gained independence as Sri Lanka, the protocol remained in place, one of the few colonial systems deliberately preserved by the new government. Today, a small brass plaque near the swimming area commemorates those lost, though few tourists pause to read its weathered inscription. The sea continues its gentle rhythm against the shore, azure and inviting, betraying nothing of what transpired in its depths on that distant afternoon when the waters of Gull Face ran red, and the world learned how quickly paradise could transform into something altogether more primeval. The warmth of the equatorial night had just begun to settle over the Strait of Malacca as the Tanjong Tin, a modest mail steamer, pushed steadily through the darkening waters. It was July 1909, and the vessel was making its scheduled journey between Singapore and Penang, carrying both mail and nearly 40 passengers through what should have been an unremarkable crossing. Captain Edward Whitley stood on the bridge, noting with mild concern the approaching dusk. The strait was notorious for its hidden shoals and unmarked reefs, dangers that multiplied tenfold once darkness fell. What the captain couldn't have anticipated was that the true danger that evening wouldn't come from below the keel, but from what would be drawn to it. At approximately 7:30 p.m., as the last golden threads of sunlight unraveled from the horizon, the Tanjong Tin shuddered violently. The vessel had struck an uncharted coral formation, tearing a jagged gash along its hull. Engineering reports quickly confirmed the worst. The ship's fuel reserves were leaking into the surrounding waters. "It's a slow leak, but steady," the chief engineer reported solemnly. "We've contained what we can, but there's a slick forming." The damaged vessel began to list slightly, though it remained seaworthy. Captain Whitley ordered distress signals sent to the nearest lighthouse at Pulau Rimau, some 15 miles distant. The lighthouse keeper acknowledged their signal but indicated that no rescue vessels could reach them before morning. The Tanjong Tin would have to weather the night where it was, surrounded by its expanding pool of oil. What happened in the following hours would fundamentally change maritime safety regulations across the British colonial territories. At approximately 8:45 p.m., a passenger leaning over the port railing reported seeing shadows moving beneath the dark, oil-slicked surface. Most dismissed it as schools of fish attracted to the unfamiliar substance now floating atop their home. By 9:30 p.m., the first scream cut through the humid night air. A young deckhand who had been checking the hull damage from a suspended bosun's chair was violently pulled into the water. Witnesses described a massive shape, like a submarine but alive, that breached the surface in a spray of black slicked water. Over the next 3 hours, the waters around the Tanjong Tin became a feeding ground. Modern analysis suggests a combination of factors created the perfect storm. The oil slick disoriented the sharks and masked the humans' presence until they were within striking distance. The damaged vessel emitted vibrations similar to wounded prey, and the dusk timing coincided with increased shark feeding activity. 5 passengers and 3 crew members were lost that night. Those who survived huddled in the center of the deck, away from the railings, as Captain Whitley maintained continuous flashing communication with the distant lighthouse. The Tanjong Tin incident led directly to the Straits Lighthouse signaling reforms of 1910, which established the first standardized emergency response protocols for vessels in distress. More significantly, it catalyzed the implementation of shark spotting stations at regular intervals along heavily traveled colonial shipping routes, with mandatory oil containment procedures that would eventually evolve into our modern environmental protection standards. The shark species responsible was never conclusively identified, though maritime records from the period suggest it may have been a particularly large tiger shark, or possibly a group of them, drawn to the unfamiliar stimuli in their hunting grounds. The waters off Makina Point had always been known for their beauty. Turquoise waves lapping against golden shores, the kind of postcard perfection that draws people from across the world to Maui. But on that December afternoon in 2020, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, those same waters would become the site of tragedy. A local spearfisher, experienced in these waters, slipped beneath the surface one final time. The 56-year-old man had spent countless hours in this very spot, harvesting fish to feed his family and neighbors. The familiar ritual of diving, holding his breath, and hunting had become second nature over decades in these waters. Witnesses later recalled seeing the surface of the ocean suddenly churn about 100 yards from shore, a splash, then crimson spreading through the blue. By the time nearby paddleboarders reached him, it was clear the attack had been devastating. Despite their valiant efforts to bring him to shore and the emergency responders who worked desperately to save him, the man succumbed to his injuries. The shark, believed to be a tiger shark measuring approximately 14 feet in length, had struck with the silent efficiency that has made these predators both feared and respected throughout human history. Marine biologists would later note that December brings murky water conditions and corresponds with tiger shark birthing season in Hawaiian waters, a combination of factors that may have contributed to the encounter. News of the attack spread quickly through the tight-knit community. For many locals, this wasn't just another shark incident making headlines. This was the loss of a friend, a neighbor, someone whose face they recognized at the local market, whose children played with theirs. As the sun set fully on Makina Point 3 evenings later, something remarkable happened. Hundreds gathered on the beach, carrying candles that flickered in the gentle evening breeze. Conservation groups who had long advocated for the protection of sharks in Hawaiian waters stood shoulder to shoulder with fishermen who had known the victim personally. The organizer of the vigil, a marine biologist who had spent decades studying tiger sharks, spoke softly to the crowd. "We gather not in fear or anger, but in respect. Respect for a man who understood the ocean and its risks. Respect for the creatures who call these waters home. And respect for the delicate balance that allows humans and sharks to coexist in these islands." As darkness fell completely, the candles created a ribbon of light along the shoreline. Some attendees waded ankle-deep into the water, letting floating lanterns drift outward as traditional Hawaiian chants filled the air. It was neither a condemnation of the shark nor a call for retribution, but rather an acknowledgement of the wild nature that surrounds these islands and the price occasionally paid for living alongside it. The following morning, surfers returned to the waters off Makina Point. Life continued, as it always does. But something had shifted in how many viewed their relationship with the ocean not as conquerors or victims, but as respectful visitors to a world where tiger sharks still reign as they have for millions of years. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pristine dunes of Boa Vista as Austrian tourist Margrethe Kleber waded into the crystalline waters. The island, a jewel in Cape Verde's archipelago crown, had been attracting increasing numbers of European tourists seeking unspoiled beaches and the promise of authentic African island life. Kleber, an experienced snorkeler, had been assured by her guidebook that the waters were safe, that nurse sharks, docile bottom feeders, were the only shark species regularly spotted close to shore. Perhaps it was this misplaced confidence that led her to venture alone into deeper waters as the light began to soften towards evening. The nearby beach had emptied somewhat as other tourists retreated to their resorts for dinner preparations. Only a handful of locals remained, collecting shellfish near the rocky outcropping that separated Boa Vista's main tourist beach from the more secluded cove where Kleber swam. The first indication something was wrong came from a local fisherman who noticed unnatural splashing approximately 60 meters offshore. What he initially dismissed as enthusiastic swimming quickly transformed into something more desperate. The water around Kleber began to churn, first white, then tinged with spreading crimson. What many tourists and even local guides failed to understand was that Cape Verde's waters had been experiencing a subtle ecological shift. Rising water temperatures and changing fishing patterns had altered traditional marine territories. Tiger sharks, normally preferring deeper waters further offshore, had been venturing increasingly closer to the island's beaches, following new feeding patterns established by smaller fish species. The tiger shark that encountered Kleber that fateful afternoon was estimated to be nearly 4 meters long, a mature specimen that likely confused her silhouette against the setting sun with that of a seal or sea turtle. The initial strike was catastrophic, severing her right leg above the knee. Despite immediate attempts by local fishermen who courageously launched their small boat toward the attack site, Kleber suffered catastrophic blood loss. She was pronounced dead shortly after reaching the island's small medical clinic. The aftermath prompted significant debate among Cape Verde's tourism officials. For years they had promoted the nurse shark misconception, inadvertently creating a false sense of security among visitors. The identification error, conflating docile nurse sharks with the more aggressive tiger shark species that occasionally patrolled the same waters, had deadly consequences. Perhaps most troubling was how preventable the tragedy had been. Marine biologists had been warning about changing shark territories for nearly 3 years before the attack. Local fishermen reported increased sightings of larger predatory species, but these warnings rarely made it into tourist literature or resort safety briefings. The Boa Vista attack served as a somber reminder that our understanding of marine environments remains imperfect, and that nature's boundaries shift in ways we don't always anticipate or respect. In the years following Kleber's death, Cape Verde implemented more comprehensive shark monitoring and warning systems, though tourism numbers on Boa Vista never fully recovered from the shadow cast by that blood-stained sunset in 2016. The shallow waters shimmer in that particularly Floridian way, sunlight dancing across gentle waves as they roll onto the sandy shores of New Smyrna Beach. It's a postcard-perfect scenione that belies this stretch of coastline's somewhat unsettling reputation. You see, while visitors flock here for the pristine beaches and excellent surfing conditions, New Smyrna has earned itself an unexpected nickname, the shark bite capital of the world. The numbers tell a rather extraordinary story. By conservative estimates, anyone who's swum at New Smyrna Beach has been within 10 feet of a shark. That's not hyperbole or exaggeration, it's simply a matter of probability in these bustling waters. Each year, nearly 40% of all recorded shark bites in the entire United States occur along this single stretch of Florida coastline. Most are what experts classify as hit and run, encounters brief, mistaken identity situations where sharks, typically blacktips or spinners, mistake a human limb for their natural prey. Most swimmers never even see the shark that bites them. They feel a sudden, sharp pain like being sliced by broken glass and only afterward discover the telltale crescent pattern of teeth marks. Surfers, with their dangling arms and legs, paddling motions that mimic struggling fish, become particularly vulnerable targets in the murky, churning surf. For decades, these incidents followed a reassuring pattern. Frightening, certainly painful, but rarely life-threatening. The majority of victims required only minor medical attention, some stitches, a tetanus shot, and perhaps an interesting scar with an even better story to share at parties. Local emergency rooms developed such routine expertise in treating these wounds that the process became almost mundane. But the summer of 2001 shattered this relatively comfortable equilibrium. On a warm August afternoon, when the beach was crowded with vacationers enjoying the final weeks of summer, the unthinkable happened. A 19-year-old swimmer ventured slightly further from shore than most casual beachgoers. What began as another typical New Smyrna shark encounter quickly escalated into something far more serious. Unlike the usual hit-and-run scenario, this particular shark, believed to be a bull shark, one of the few species known for its potential aggression toward humans, did not release after the initial bite. The attack sent ripples of concern throughout coastal communities everywhere, but particularly in Volusia County. Local officials found themselves facing a delicate balance, acknowledging the tragedy while preventing unnecessary panic about a statistically rare event. In response, they launched what would become one of the most comprehensive public education initiatives ever developed for shark awareness. The programs that emerged focused not on fear, but on understanding. Marine biologists worked alongside local lifeguards to develop educational materials explaining shark behavior, identifying high-risk conditions, and teaching simple precautions that dramatically reduce the already minimal chance of a serious encounter. Signs appeared along beach access points, not as ominous warnings, but as informative guides to sharing the water safely with its natural inhabitants. Perhaps most importantly, the initiative helped reshape public perception of sharks not as mindless killing machines, but as essential predators maintaining the delicate balance of marine ecosystems, predators who, in almost every case, have absolutely no interest in humans as prey. In the summer of 1973, as the warm South China Sea currents shifted and collided with cooler northern air, a typhoon began to form. The locals of Hainan Island called it the Quiet Dragon, not for any gentleness, but for how it seemed to hover silently before unleashing its fury. Weather stations tracked its approach for days, but forecasting technology was primitive by today's standards. Some fishing captains, pressured by quotas and family obligations, chose to risk the journey despite the warnings. 42 vessels from the Eastern Hainan Fishing Cooperative ventured out that August morning. Most were wooden trawlers, the kind that had plied these waters for generations. By midday, the storm had accelerated beyond all predictions. Radio communications captured fragments of panic, calls for bearing changes, desperate attempts to return to harbor, and finally, silence. The typhoon raged for 36 hours. When it cleared, the sea appeared deceptively calm, as though nothing had happened. But scattered across 80 square miles of ocean were the remains of the fleet, splintered hulls, waterlogged cargo, fishing gear, and the bodies of fishermen who had not survived the initial sinking of their vessels. What happened next has been documented by only 3 survivors, men who clung to a capsized hull for nearly 4 days. As the debris field drifted along the current, it attracted attention from beneath. First came the smaller reef sharks, drawn by the scent of fish catch spilled from ruptured holds. But by the second day, larger species arrived, tigers, bulls, and oceanic whitetips, the latter considered by many marine biologists to be among the most dangerous sharks in open water scenarios. The survivors described how the sharks moved methodically through the scattered wreckage, investigating every floating object with cold precision. The feeding began slowly, then accelerated into what one survivor called a gathering storm of fins and teeth. The official death toll from the typhoon was 117 fishermen, but those who studied the incident believe as many as 38 of those men survived the initial sinking, only to face the circling predators in the debris field. In the coastal villages of eastern Hainan, the tragedy entered local folklore. mothers began singing a lullaby to their children about the sea's twofold danger, the dragon above and the tigers below. The haunting melody speaks of watching the sky and water with equal vigilance. Even today, fishing families on the island maintain a superstition about setting sail when certain cloud formations appear on the horizon. Marine biologists studying shark behavior point to the Hainan incident as a textbook example of how normal scavenging can escalate into predatory feeding when blood scent saturates an area of ocean. What began as natural cleanup behavior transformed into one of history's most devastating shark attack events, not because the sharks were unusually aggressive, but because humans and predators converged in a perfect storm of circumstance and timing. The debris field eventually dispersed. The sharks returned to their normal patterns, and the sea once again appeared serene and inviting. But for the fishing communities of Hainan Island, the waters would never look quite the same again. The gentle current of Ningaloo Reef carries the morning sun through its waters, catching on the scales of passing fish in glints of silver and gold. Here, where the Western Australian coastline curves into the Indian Ocean, one of the world's most pristine marine ecosystems breathes with the tide. The very waters that once witnessed tragedy now host something remarkable, healing. Above the surface, almost invisible against the cloudless sky, a small drone hovers. Its electric hum is lost to the wind, but its cameras capture everything below: the shifting patterns of sand, the clusters of coral, and most importantly, the distinctive shadows of larger marine life. The drones have become Ningaloo's silent guardians, an early warning system that has transformed how humans and sharks share these waters. "We don't call them shark patrols anymore," explains marine biologist Eliza Chapman, her voice soft with reverence for this place. "We prefer ocean monitoring because it's not about fear. It's about understanding patterns, migrations, coexistence." The drone program began after the attacks of 2026, when 3 swimmers were lost in a single season. The community faced a choice: abandon these waters or find a way forward. They chose the harder path. In the cool shade of a beach pavilion, a group of tourists listen attentively as a local guide explains the Ningaloo Pledge, a promise that every visitor makes before entering these waters. Not a waiver absolving anyone of responsibility, but rather the opposite, an acknowledgement of respect for the ocean and its inhabitants. "We are guests here," the guide says, her weathered hands tracing the outline of the reef on a laminated map, "and guests should know the house rules." The pledge is simple: never swim alone, respect closure notices without question, understand tidal patterns, report all sightings without alarm, and most importantly, remember that fear is the enemy of wisdom. Research stations dot the coastline now, their solar panels turning with the sun. Inside, scientists track migration patterns, feeding behaviors, and the subtle ways climate change is altering this delicate ecosystem. They've discovered that shark encounters decrease dramatically when humans adjust their habits rather than expecting the ocean to adjust to theirs. As twilight approaches, a family wades into the shallows, their silhouettes gold-tipped by the setting sun. The children splash with quiet joy, their parents nearby, eyes occasionally scanning the horizon, not with paranoia, but with the calm vigilance that has become second nature here. The drone returns to its charging station, its batteries depleted but its data invaluable. Tomorrow it will fly again, part of humanity's evolving relationship with the sea's most misunderstood predators. Perhaps what's most remarkable about Ningaloo today isn't the technology or even the science, it's the perspective. The reef has become a place where people come not despite the presence of sharks, but partly because of it, a rare corner of the world where we've chosen to adapt rather than dominate.